In the previous lesson, we implemented support for getting resources from our REST API, and in this lesson, we will implement support for creating resources. We're going to tie this into some best practices when it comes to creating resources, returning the correct status codes and response headers, and we are also going to discuss mapping to and from our DTOs and what are some ways that we can solve this. We're going to start from the habits controller, where we already have two get endpoints. One for returning a collection of habits, and one for returning a single habit resource. And now what I want to do is to introduce another API endpoint for creating a habit. Now for this, we're going to use the HTTP post method, and we're going to define a respective endpoint on our controller. For now, let's make it return a task of an action result. I will return a habit DTO after creating it, and let's call this the create habit method. And let's give this a name of create habit. Now what do we need here? We need a way to accept a request object that is going to represent the habit resource that we want to create. So what we could do is accept the habit entity directly, but this would again be coupling our internal contract with the external contract of our API. Now, accepting a habit DTO might seem like a viable option, but if we take a look at the habit DTO implementation, you will see that it has a lot of required fields, one of which is the identifier. And we don't have a value for this field before we create a resource. So using the habit DTO directly isn't a solution that we could follow. So what if we create a separate DTO for creating a habit, and we could call it create habit DTO. This would only contain the subset of the fields that are required for creating a habit. We could then map this into our habit entity, and this will allow us to persist our new entity using EF Core. So let's see what this type could look like. I will create it in the habits folder, and let's call it the create habit DTO. Instead of using a class, let's also use a record, and I'm going to copy the properties that we have inside of the habit DTO and paste them into the create habit DTO. And then let's discuss what are the properties that we will need and what are the ones that we can omit for the representation that's required to create a habit. Well, first of all, we won't need the identifier, so I can remove that. Secondly, the date time properties created at, updated at, and last completed at are also something that I don't want to expose as my public API contract. Being able to set the status of my habit or make it archived also isn't something that I want to support when creating a habit, so I'm going to omit these properties, and this is what we are left with in the create habit DTO. Now, one thing you could consider is creating a base class that is going to contain these properties, and then using that base class from the habit DTO and the create habit DTO. I'm personally not a fan of this, as it introduces some coupling between DTOs that I may want to keep separate. So my pragmatic decision is to live with a bit of code duplication in order to have more flexibility when it comes to how I want to implement different operations in my system. So now that we have the create habit DTO, what can we do with it? Let's rename this to be create habit DTO. And now what I need to do is to create a new habit entity. And we're basically just going to map from the create habit DTO into the habit entity. What about the properties that aren't part of the DTO? Well, those you can set manually. For example, let's say I want to define the identifier of the habit. I want to use a prefix where H is short for habit. And then I'm going to define a version 7 UUID, which is available starting from .NET 9. And this will allow me to create my custom identifier for the habit resource. I discussed what are the benefits of this approach in a previous lesson, but essentially using a prefix allows us to easily identify resource identifiers inside of our system by just looking at them. And secondly, using a version 7 UUID gives me sortable identifiers, which are going to play nicely with the database, and are also going to come in handy when I want to implement pagination. So after setting the ID, we have to map all of the remaining properties from the DTO into my entity. And this can prove to be somewhat cumbersome and also repetitive. So let's see if there's a way to fix this and also improve on the mapping logic from our previous two endpoints. So I'm going to create a new class inside of the habits folder that I will call the habit mappings. And I'm going to paste in the implementation, and here's what we will have inside. This is going to be a static class that defines an extension method on the createHabitDTO type, and the extension method is called toEntity. It's going to encapsulate the mapping from the createHabitDTO into my entity, while also setting the required properties, such as the identifier, the missing properties that aren't available on the createHabitDTO, such as the status, the archive field, and any other default values I may want to create, for example, the created@UTC property, and then I'll be able to use this extension method inside of my controller. So if we go back to the controller, we can replace this with createHabitDTO toEntity, and this should give us back a new habit instance. So now I can go ahead and say database context habits and introduce my new habit by calling add and then specifying habit. Then I need to persist my changes by calling save changes async. And now I need to return my response. As you can see, I want to return my habit DTO, but what I have is a habit. So let's do some more copy pasting. I'm going to grab this piece of code here, and I promise this will make a lot more sense in a couple of moments, but just bear with me for this presentation. So let's return a habit DTO by initializing a new DTO instance, and I'm going to replace all references to H that you can see here with my habit type. So now I should be able to map to my habit DTO type, and I can return it as the result of this endpoint. So at this point, we are already duplicating this piece of code in 3 of our endpoints. So now is probably a good time to spend a moment and think about how we can simplify this. There's a subtle difference between this mapping here, which is mapping an object into a DTO, and this mapping here, which is actually an expression which uses EF core under the hood. So what I can do is try to extract this into a method. This is a refactoring that you have available in Visual Studio, although what you're seeing here is ReSharper, but nonetheless, extract method is a pretty common refactoring. So let's extract this into a method called toDTO, and here's what that method will look like. It's a static method returning an expression which contains a function mapping from a habit into a habit DTO. And you can specify this inside of your LINQ queries, and this is going to work just the same. So I can also simplify my first endpoint to remove all of the mapping code and reference what I have in the toDTO method. And you're probably guessing where I'm going with this. Now what I can do is take this method here and move it into the habit mappings class. So let's move it here. I will make it public. And now in order to be able to reference it from my controller, I'm going to delete it here. And inside of my endpoints, I'm going to say habit mappings toDTO. Let's also do the same in the above call. And this allows me to somewhat simplify my select statements. Now, if we take this further, we can also define some extension methods on the database context itself, or even the database set, to simplify this mapping. And strictly speaking, from an implementation perspective, we're kind of coupling two concerns here: mapping objects, and by introducing expressions, we're moving into database queries. So let's consider for a moment how we could split these responsibilities. Let's say I want to extract the query mapping into a separate static type. Let's call this the habit queries. Inside of it, I'm going to paste what I already had, but instead of calling it toDTO, let's call it project toDTO, because what we are essentially doing is applying a projection. And now back in my controllers, I'm going to reference the habit queries and call the project toDTO method. Let's also do the same below. And mind you, this is only taking care of the select statement. Everything else is still part of our original query. Now back to the habit mappings. I want to reuse this piece of code for mapping from a habit into a DTO and define another extension method here. So in the habit mappings, I want an extension method that returns a habit DTO, and let's call it toDTO. It's going to be an extension method on the habit type, and I'm just going to use H because this is what I was using in the expression here,